Greetings, everyone. This is Joyce Davis. I am the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg, and we're here again with another Great Decisions discussion. We do these great decisions to try to help keep people in our region and our associates well informed on the top issues that are impacting the globe. And one of those issues is one that I think is fascinating. Today we're going to be talking about understanding Indonesia. Now, I have been one of the privileged people to be able to actually visit Indonesia, but you're not going to have to listen to me tell you how to understand Indonesia. We actually have an expert, Dr. Amy Freedman. Hello, Dr. Amy Freedman. Amy, she says to call her. She is going to be leading our discussion today. And I'm going to give you a little bit more about her bio after we watch our video. But she's been in this region and knows us well. So I'm looking forward to hearing from her. And Dr. Freeman, you want to say hello? Just a quick hello to everyone before we watch the video?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and I guess this is sort of to be a virtual homecoming for me to Central PA. Thank you.
Well, we're glad to have you here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, who is going to key up, or however you say it, our video, and we will watch that, and then I will give a more formal introduction to our esteemed guest. Michelle?
The United States stands at this time at the pinnacle of world power. It is a solemn moment for the American democracy. For with primacy in power is also joined an awe-inspiring accountability to the future.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Great Decisions Masterclass. Here in week number 6, our attention turns to an interesting and important country in Southeast Asia, Indonesia. Today we have 3 main considerations before we think about U.S. foreign policy options towards Indonesia. We'd first like to gain an understanding of the country. Next, we'll look at its geostrategic location in the world and how that plays into both American and Indonesian foreign policy decision-making. And finally, we'll look into the future to think about the direction that this country may be headed. Indonesia is a country of islands, more than 17,000 of them, as you can see from this map. The 2 principal islands, the ones most of us will recognize, are Java and Sumatra. It is on these 2 islands that the vast majority of Indonesians live, and it is here that we can find Jakarta, the current capital of the country. However, there is a major change underway as Indonesia has decided to relocate its capital to the island to the north. Moving an entire capital city is no small task. This is a process that has taken a great deal of planning, and as you can see here, the construction is well underway. This is a planned city, which means no one currently lives there. They're going to map this out and construct it from the ground up and then be ready for operation. You can see the artist rendition of what the government is expected to look like once all of the construction is completed. The price tag is in the neighborhood of $35 billion. So what's wrong with Jakarta? An aerial view reveals a vibrant city, a relatively modern city. Are there issues and problems here that have forced Indonesia to reconsider the capital city's location? First of all, there is the problem of traffic. Like almost no other, Jakarta is overwhelmed with cars, with demand. Infrastructure just has not kept up, and they're really out of room to grow. It's harder to add roads when the city is so very crowded. There's also the problem of flooding in Jakarta. There are more than a dozen rivers that run into the city. They oftentimes overflow, and this causes very real problems. And the city finds itself underwater, both by the river flow and also another very serious problem, which is the fact that there's very limited public water supply. And you couple that with the fact that there aren't many efforts by the government to provide new sources of water, means that every individual family or business is digging their own well, and as a result of that, the capital of Indonesia is sinking. The groundwater is being tapped. It is causing a sinking of the city. We see the very same thing happening in Mexico City because of the depletion of underground water sources. Indonesia, by the numbers, this is a very large country in terms of population, 279 million people. This means that it is fourth in the world in terms of population size after India, China, and the United States. It is a top 20 economy by aggregate size, but its per capita income is only $4,000 per year. The unemployment rate is pretty modest, and the median age of the country is 29. Compare that with the United States and China, where the median age is 39. What this means is that Indonesia is in the midst of the great race. It's a race that every country undergoes, at least those that seek to be wealthy countries in the world. It's a race between population and wealth. As population increases, economic activity follows, and generally speaking, wealth on a per capita level improves also. And at some point, per capita income should really catch up, if not overtake, the rise in population. This is the great race, because what you're trying to do is get wealthy before you begin to age as a nation. So we have our boundary there for wealthy status. For the United States, we became wealthy long before our population began to age. China, on the other hand, lost this race. It's getting older before it became wealthy. And this is not something that you can simply undo. Once this race is lost, it is lost for good. Indonesia's status in this race is not yet determined. But we can, by looking at the demographic pyramid, say that the pressure is on because the window of opportunity appears to be closing. Look at those aged 9 and lower. That generation is smaller than the generations that preceded it. So Indonesia is really in the same position as India. They both have a median age of about 29, and they're both racing to become wealthy as a nation before they become older as a nation, and therefore their population begins to decline. In terms of religion, Indonesia is an overwhelmingly Muslim country. Islam arrived many centuries ago on the western tip and spread throughout the country. There is a Christian majority area you can see in blue and a Hindu majority area in the orange. Bali is one of the most recognized names in Indonesia, a very populous tourist spot for people from all over the globe, especially Australians on vacation. It was there some 2 decades ago that a devastating bombing occurred. 3 devices exploded. They were planted by Al-Qaeda forces, and they claimed the lives of more than 200 people. This in retaliation for Australia's support of America's military presence in the Middle East and the war ongoing at the time in Afghanistan. Off to the east a little further, we have the area that is called East Timor. This is a place where Christians are the predominant majority. It was under Portuguese rule until 1975, when Portugal let go. There was an open question as to what would happen to East Timor. Should it be an independent country or should it join one of its neighbors? Indonesia decided to take control of it and brutally oppress this little island for about a quarter of a century. It gained statehood only in 2002. The geostrategic considerations of Indonesia are next. This is an area where both geopolitics and geoeconomics can play a very important role in what happens in country. During the Cold War, it was all about geopolitics. There was communism in the Soviet Union, in China, in Indochina. Once the Vietnamese state was reunified and it came to occupy Cambodia and Laos, the major American concern was what happens to Indonesia. Is that axis of communism going to spread down into Jakarta and really put the U.S. on the outside looking in?
Indonesia, most populous of all the nations in Southeast Asia, moved at one time, under the stormy leadership of Sukarno, to the very brink of communism. But in 1965, Indonesia's people turned against Sukarno and Red China, erasing the threat of a communist takeover in the island empire. Today, communism still covets Southeast Asia, and terror is a favorite tactic.
So American presidents, including Richard Nixon, showed very strong support for Indonesia. What their leadership wanted, we did our best to provide. We also gave them the green light at times for military operations, including that of East Timor. We recognized that keeping Indonesia as a close ally and a bulwark against communism was more important than the lives and humanitarian situation on the island of East Timor. We wanted to draw a very strong line, keeping communism at bay, maintaining it only in the areas where it existed at the time. Political realism, this is where the powerful take what they want and the weak suffer what they must, with the East Timorese being the weak in this analogy. It is sometimes referred to as the forgotten genocide. Very few people talk about it. This is a very small population to begin with, so 300,000 killed is an extraordinary percentage of the overall population. Roughly 1/4 of all East Timorese were killed by Indonesian forces. The Cold War ended, leading to a whole new era in world politics. And in the 1990s, it wasn't so much geopolitics as it was geoeconomics that would influence Indonesia. It all started in Thailand, where the government undertook an effort to decrease the value of their currency. The currency was called the pickle. That's its nickname. We don't know exactly why. Maybe because it was worth about a nickel during the Vietnam War. But, I mean, we Americans can't really make fun of that. We call our dollars clams. So I'm sure that confuses others as well. But what happened in Thailand that was very serious was the spread of an economic contagion. It's called the Asian economic collapse, or the Asian flu. It spread very quickly to other parts of Southeast Asia, including Indonesia. And with that economic calamity came a great deal of political instability. People in Indonesia took to the streets. They had lost their jobs, their way of life. They blamed the government for not being there for them. And they began to demand change at the political top, which happened shortly thereafter. And it's rather remarkable because the president of Indonesia was about as strong as any president in the international system. He'd been in power for 35 years, and there was a full expectation that he would remain in power as long as he was alive. But he was forced to step down because of the protest resulting from the economic collapse of East Asia. We and Australia offered a financial bailout to Indonesia. We'll help you through the International Monetary Fund, but we're going to link that aid to a relinquishment of your control over East Timor. You've been there for 25 years. It's time to go. It's time to let East Timor decide its own fate. And it decided through a national referendum overwhelmingly to become an independent country, statehood, and now a member of the United Nations. Indonesia has had a number of duly elected presidents. It is, however, only the 77th ranked democracy in the world. By comparison, the United States today is ranked 36th, which is a national embarrassment. We should be in the top 5. We've let things get away from us here at home. By the time that you view this video, there will likely be a new Indonesian president. National elections in this very large democracy are slated for February of 24, and because of constitutional term limits, the current incumbent is not allowed to run for re-election. So what is the future of this intriguing state of Southeast Asia? From an economic perspective, the trajectory of the country is pretty impressive. Large amounts of growth have occurred over the course of the last couple of generations. You'll see the very strong downturn. That was the economic contagion that began in Thailand and spread at the end of the 1990s. And it was then that the International Monetary Fund stepped in what is referred to as a bridge loan. We're going to lend you money to bridge the gap because of your economic downturn, encouraging countries to remain in the global trading network. Because when there is a severe economic downturn, there's always the temptation to raise tariff barriers, stop importing foreign goods, and manufacture everything at home. That runs counter to capitalism and free trade. So these bridge loans are used to keep countries in the game until they can recover. And then more recently, COVID resulted in a significant economic downturn for Indonesia, as was the case with most countries in the system. Its economy is increasingly sophisticated and stratified. It is an industry and service economy. Agriculture no longer is the dominant force it once was. Indonesia is categorized as an emerging economy, a member of the G20, which is to say you've largely made it, and now you can help other countries on the upward climb. And believe it or not, by mid-century, many economists believe it will be a top 4 economy in the international system. So this is a force to be reckoned with in world politics, and we certainly want good political relations and smooth trading relations with the country. Geostrategically and economically located at a vital shipping point in the world, a substantial amount of world cargo is going to pass through the straits near Indonesia on any given day. Some 1,000 pass through each and every week. The range of scenarios for Indonesia into the 21st century, they're positive and they're negative. This is one of those countries, a bit like Turkey, that we really look at with great interest, but not a whole lot of certainty as to the direction it's going to go. On the positive side, it may evolve into a stable democracy, a trading state, very much like Japan and the Philippines, and become an anchor for American foreign policy in the region. Or conversely, it could destabilize. There could be retraction, a movement more towards ethno-religious identity, or even a disintegration of the modern state of Indonesia. So how are we to prepare, and what can we do to encourage Indonesia to move along the positive line of the spectrum as opposed to the negative? There are opportunities. We can support stability and the territorial integrity of the country by working with Indonesia directly and along with our allies, such as Japan and financial institutions, to provide resources that allow Indonesia to develop the infrastructure, the industry, the ports of call, the sorts of things they need to further develop and stratify their economies. We should make reasonable demands upon them, understanding that as a democracy of a lot of poor people, their government is expected to provide for those who cannot provide for themselves. And we can always link our aid to progress made on the ground, again, as long as our demands are reasonable. In terms of our military policy towards the country, we can continue what we've been doing for the past couple of generations, promoting closer military to military ties by training the Indonesian military as a professional one. This means rigorous training, the use of Western military manuals, a policy of merit-based promotions as opposed to proximity to individuals in power. We do need to step up our game when it comes to Indonesia's Navy and Air Force. They've largely been outside the realm of cooperation, and also a great deal has to be done as it relates to the Indonesian military and human rights challenges. Promoting and restoring Indonesia's regional security role would be a step in the right direction. There's a relationship that has soured between Indonesia and Australia, largely because of East Timor. It was damaged during that crisis, and there's really no reason that these two countries can't move beyond that and begin to work more closely with one another. Perhaps some have argued a regional crisis reaction force involving Indonesia would further our relationship and help that country move in the right direction. ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It was created to counter Vietnam. Once China rose as a major threat, Vietnam joined ASEAN and helped those countries, including Indonesia, counter the Chinese presence in the region. So we could connect ASEAN to bilateral defense accords that already exist, begin to make contingency planning for emergencies, and possibly even sign a new defense pact with the United States. This is Indonesia's region. It is the Pacific, is South Asia, and specifically Southeast Asia. Countries in blue like India, Vietnam, and Japan are counteracting China and its rising influence, while those in red, including places like Laos and Cambodia and Pakistan, are trending more towards China. Those up for grabs are the countries in green, which includes vital American historical allies like Indonesia and the Philippines. We really should not see those countries in play. They should be on the American side. I would call them key pickup states for the United States if we can handle our policies correctly. Certainly of note is the Quad Alliance. It was created decades ago, although given more energy and resources by the Trump administration. It is a geostrategic alliance connecting the United States to Australia and Japan, and then over to India. As you can see, it is principally designed to counterbalance China and its aggressive diplomatic and military moves in the South China Sea. At the geographic center of the Quad Alliance is Indonesia. And that means that this country is a very important issue for American foreign policies moving forward, and no doubt is meritorious of great decisions status. I thank you as always for joining me. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
Well, that was quite an overview of Indonesia and why we need to be very careful and care about it, for one thing. But to lead us in better understanding this topic and to perhaps engage in some discussion a little bit later is Dr. Amy L. Freedman. She is professor and department chair of political science department at Pace University, and she's also associate research scholar at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute of Columbia University. Now, Dr. Freeman is an adjunct associate research scholar at the Weatherhead East Asia Institute, and she is widely published. Her work basically looks at Southeast Asia with a particular focus on Indonesia and Malaysia. Now, here's what is really interesting to us. From 1998 to 2006, Professor Freedman taught at Franklin and Marshall College right here in our area. Now, as I say, she is widely published, and her most recent book is Threatening the State, the Internationalization of Internal Conflicts. And previous books have included Political Change and Consolidation, Democracy's Rocky Road in Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, and Malaysia, and Political Participation in Ethnic Minorities. Now, she is co-editor of Asian Security and author, of course, of numerous articles, and her work appears in the Journal of Civil Society, Religion and Politics, etc. But let me tell you, I could go on because she is a very accomplished professor, and we're delighted to have her here. So without leaving time for her to say something, I'm going to end her bio and turn it over to Amy Freedman. Welcome, Amy.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Davis. And I appreciate the opportunity to, as I said before, virtually revisit central Pennsylvania. I'm happy to share a little bit further in response to the video. And then I really do want to make sure that there's enough time for Q&A and to focus on the things that people are more interested in. So I am going to pull up a couple of slides, and I will try and keep half an eye on the time because, as I said before, academics like to hear themselves talk, and so it doesn't have to all be coming from me. So I think the video, oops, let's see if I can orient myself here. Here we go. I think the video does a really good job laying out some of the big trends that we want to understand more about with Indonesia. I have a number of points, I guess, that I would quibble with, and really my points of disagreement are really less about, kind of going toe to toe over facts, although I pulled out kind of two examples here. But I'm going to use these examples to highlight what I want to structure the rest of my remarks around. So again, I pulled up two examples here. The video talks about the nightclub bombings in Bali, and labels them as the work of Al-Qaeda. They actually were the work of a group called Jemaah Islamiyah, which is a very fragmented group. It's actually loosely connected with lots of other militarized Islamic movements in the region. And the bombings, most people believe, were not really aimed directly at Australia, but rather were aimed at the Indonesian government for its perceived closeness with the West. And the acts of violence, the bombings in Bali, were just two examples of several horrible terror attacks in Indonesia in the early 2000s. And they were just one part of a larger strategy advocating for a greater role of Islam and the creation of an Islamic caliphate in Southeast Asia. By labeling this as an attack by Al-Qaeda and sort of lumping it together with more global goals and goals that really revolve around, let's say, the US, or in this case, Australia, I think you're shifting the lens and you're kind of sweeping away the internal dynamics of what's actually going on in Indonesia. And again, I'll come back to some of this. The second point that I pulled out to take issue with was really over the US's relationship with Indonesia in the 1950s and the 1960s. And the video really sort of uses US, video newsreels at the time, sort of propaganda-esque reels at the time. And Indonesia was very chaotic in the 1950s. President Sukarno was trying to unite the country and stabilize it after independence. And in fact, the United States, as the video says, we were very concerned about communism, but we intervened quite directly in Indonesia in the late 1950s and the 1960s, actually aiding and armed revolts against President Sukarno. So we were very much part of the chaos and instability in the country. And the video makes no mention of a horrific spasm of violence. A coup attempt was launched against President Sukarno in 1965. And in the aftermath of that, he's pushed aside and President Suharto comes to power. He'd been a military leader. And the aftermath of that, the US supported the new president, Suharto, in going after the communists and anyone suspected of maybe even remotely being affiliated with the communists or sympathetic to the communists. And almost 1 million people were killed. And the United States, and documents have actually been declassified relatively recently, showing the US kind of behind the scenes as these reprisals were taking place in the country. So anyway, I mentioned these 2 points, not to really just quibble about facts, but to highlight 2 things. One, the US doesn't always have a great understanding of Indonesia. And second, Indonesia and the United States have different priorities, both for our relations with each other and for wider regional relations. So I really want to just highlight a couple of these dynamics. I used the same categories that the video did to think about these things. Economically, the US and Indonesia have points of economic conversion, areas where I think we can cooperate. but we're not always on the same page. So for example, the US wants to promote trade liberalization, right? Opening Indonesia up to greater foreign investment. But both President Jokowi, who's the outgoing president, and the incoming president, Prabowo, are much more economic nationalists. And so I think there are competing interests economically. Geostrategically, Indonesia welcomes cooperation with the United States on some military and security issues, but is really unwilling to change what is a very long-standing policy of non-alignment. And that goes back to the 1950s. And Indonesia has pretty consistently demonstrated that they want to maintain close ties to China, particularly in economic things. And they don't want to be boxed in by the United States into having to pick a side. And again, I'll come back to that. On institution building, I think we are likely to see Indonesia under Prabowo, right, the winner of the election, take a bigger role on the world stage, both regionally with ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, but also globally with issues like the Russia-Ukraine war and Israel and Gaza. And again, the United States and Indonesia may not be on the same page with these priorities. So maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. One possible stumbling point is this question about Indonesia and democracy and human rights. So Prabowo's victory in the February election has concerned a lot of people who are concerned with democracy and human rights. He's a former general. He has been accused, and there's pretty good documentation, of engaging in significant human rights abuses, both in East Timor, at that moment when East Timor had a referendum and overwhelmingly decided to break free of Indonesia. This is in the wake of the financial crisis. And there was horrific violence, and the Indonesian military intervened to try and stop independence, and Prabowo was part of atrocities documented there. He also has some culpability for the military's horrific use of violence in Papua and against anti-Suharto protesters in 1998. And again, that was mentioned in the video, this protest during the economic crisis. And at first, President Suharto tried to squash the demonstrations, he tried to hold on to power, and his military, right, Prabowo, high-ranking military official at the time, kidnapped and disappeared, and several protesters were killed. He's never been held accountable for any of these things. And he has a pretty long record of denigrating and saying that democracy doesn't matter and maybe it's not important for Indonesia. It is an open question whether he still believes that. He hasn't, the last couple of years, he has toned that way down. So maybe he will play by the rules, and maybe we don't need to worry about Indonesian democracy, but there are some causes for concern. Indonesia in the early 2000s was actually an active promoter of democracy in Southeast Asia, and it was this moment in the region where countries were doing better, right? Elections were freer and more competitive. The press was freer, civil society groups were freer, but there has been an erosion of that in the last 10 years or so, with some minor exceptions. It would be wonderful if Prabowo decides that democracy is a good thing and plays a bigger role in the region, trying to encourage fellow leaders to kind of move in the right direction on that. But if the opposite occurs, losing Indonesia as sort of a voice and a symbol of democracy in Southeast Asia could also have negative effects. So I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about the recent election, but there are some really interesting things that that took place. You see these pictures. So Prabowo, he's run for president. I think this was his third go round at running for the highest office. And he really took a completely different strategy this time. He used cute and cuddly kind of caricatures, cartoon figures of himself, and he portrayed himself as a cute grandpa running for office. This, of course, is a real 180 from an image of a strong man, a general, right, like a tough guy. He won hands down, in part because he had the blessing of the outgoing president, Jokowi, and his running mate is Jokowi's son. And they had to actually give an exception to allow Jokowi's son to run for office because he's too young, according to the Constitution. But a court ruled, a judge appointed by Jokowi ruled that, to change the age at which candidates could run for the presidency. And so this pairing, Prabowo and Gibran, won president and vice president. And we can talk a little bit, if people are interested, about kind of the dynamics of how Indonesian voters kind of went along with this, the shift in his image. So again, if people are interested in that. So what does the U.S. want from our relationship with Indonesia? And I put this in three categories. Economically, the U.S. would like trade liberalization, particularly in mineral exports, right? Indonesia is home to all kinds of things that we need in a high-tech economy, right? Nickel and all kinds of minerals. What we want geostrategically is we would like Indonesia to side with us and balance against China. We would also like Indonesia to be a reliable, stable partner in the region to complement our relations with Japan, Australia, India, and the Philippines. But what does Indonesia want from us? And they're not really the same thing. So first and foremost, what Indonesia really wants, and they're not unique in this, is I've said recognition, respect, and consistency. The U.S.'s attention to Southeast Asia tends to be maybe mercurial, right? Fleeting. So presidents, going back 20 years have said, Asia is important. This is going to be the focus of our attention. But then we tend to get pulled in other directions, right? The war on terror, the 2008 financial crisis, the Middle East, Ukraine, right? There always seems to be some other big crisis, and our attention gets pulled away. In terms of really kind of microscopic things, and it sounds unimportant, but it is actually important in the world of diplomacy, we have a really inconsistent track record of sending high-ranking officials to key regional meetings. So the ASEAN meetings, the ASEAN Regional Forum meetings, which are foreign policy and defense meetings. And we often, and this is not just a Democrat or Republican thing, we often send fairly low-level officials. And so countries in the region, particularly Indonesia, tend to feel slighted. Biden went to Vietnam before the ASEAN meetings last year, and that was really read in Jakarta as a snub, right? Obama kept promising this pivot to Asia that, again, never really materialized. Obama had these personal ties to Indonesia, but his trip to the country kept getting canceled. Now, for very good, understandable reasons. But again, there's this pattern that emerges where Jakarta feels that the United States, isn't really, putting Indonesia first, shall we say. The Trump administration had very little interest in Southeast Asia beyond pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, this free trade deal. The Trump administration promoted instead the free and open Indo-Pacific, which doesn't, again, have a lot of meat behind it. And Indonesia is skeptical, as the video mentioned, of Australia. And so it makes them a little bit skeptical of this pairing, the AUKUS pairing, the Australia, right, UK and US kind of triad. And the troubled relationship between Indonesia and Australia is sort of multidimensional. It has to do with Australia's closed immigration policies. It has to do with, as I said, East Timor. And it also has to do with questions about treatment of Australians who are arrested within Indonesia for various crimes like drug trafficking. So some of these are what you might think of as kind of small bore issues, but there are points of agreement on larger things like how to treat China. The Biden administration has done a little better. We sent Vice President Kamala Harris. We hosted Prabowo in 2020 when he was defense minister, and there had been a ban on allowing him to travel to the US because of the accusations of atrocities he committed. We had to let that go when he was brought in to Jokowi's cabinet as defense minister. But here, the big point really is that the US just has a history of prioritizing different issues than countries in the region wish we would. And so that leaves them feeling frustrated and sometimes even feeling disrespected. So I think I only have one or two other points, and then we can open it for Q&A. I wanted to go back to Indonesia's position in this US-China rivalry, this balancing question. And Indonesia's position of non-alignment, as I said before, goes back to the 1950s, where really Sukarno wanted to avoid being pulled into this rivalry. The US didn't take kindly to that, and Sukarno really didn't understand why the US felt that it had to be this all or nothing relationship. And there's some really interesting things that Sukarno wrote about and spoke about, being disappointed in the United States. He really loved the United States. He could quote Thomas Jefferson, and he wanted a close relationship with the United States, but he didn't see it as this zero-sum game, right? This kind of hard balancing strategy. After 1965, yes, President Suharto moved firmly into the US's orbit, right? But what we're seeing now, I think, again, is a return to this desire in Indonesia for more flexibility, really a hedging strategy. Clearly, the United States and China are both vying for support all over Southeast Asia, as that last map indicated. And Indonesia is not alone. Other countries in the region are saying to the US, both privately and in public forums, don't make us choose, right? China is next door, right? We, Indonesia, we, Malaysia, we, Thailand, we have to live with China. They're not going anywhere. And China has both diplomatically and economically offered countries in Southeast Asia a lot of goodies, right? Infrastructure spending, trade deals. China has been very savvy at really waging a kind of public diplomacy campaign in the region. And it's unclear that the US has been able to answer that particularly well. Having said that, Indonesia in particular does welcome US military support, particularly in the South China Seas, and you have an upcoming session really talking about, I think, right, the big rivalries across the world's oceans. And Indonesia has a long-running dispute in an area called Nantua, where the Chinese Coast Guard, and Coast Guard should sort of be put in quotes, really harasses Indonesian fishermen and behaves pretty belligerently. But again, Indonesia doesn't want to provoke China. It welcomes Chinese investment, building railroads, Chinese companies helping to build the new capital. So Indonesia really doesn't want to be forced to pick sides with that. All right. There are a couple of complications, I think, for Indonesia in U.S. foreign policy. One, our support for Israel. This has been a long-standing problem for Indonesian leaders. And when I say that, I mean, it's a domestic political problem, right? That because Indonesia is a democracy, a flawed democracy, but a democracy nonetheless, leaders are very concerned with public opinion, right? And so when U.S. support for Israel comes up, Indonesian leaders are very wary of sort of throwing their support to the U.S. Within Indonesia, there's a lot of support for the Palestinians, their quest for statehood, and the U.S.'s support for Israel, particularly right now, builds on a perception in Indonesia that the United States repeatedly targets Muslim countries, and Indonesians, and here I'm talking really more about kind of popular opinion, public opinion, rather than elite opinion. But there is a sense that the U.S. maybe doesn't care, or worse, right, is hostile to Muslim countries. And again, this poses a problem for Indonesian leaders, right? A domestic political problem. I said at the bottom, and again, I'm happy to talk about this in a moment, China's treatment of the Uyghurs, the Muslim community within China, is not given the same scrutiny within Indonesia as the U.S. support for Israel, and let's say the U.S. war on terror is given. And we could talk about that if people are interested. All right. So looking forward, and I think this is the end. Indonesia would like more investment from the U.S., particularly the green energy sector. People-to-people ties are really helpful. The number of Indonesians studying in the United States has stayed pretty stagnant. It has not increased. More Indonesians actually are going to China now. So there's room for the U.S. to do more. Pro-U.S. feelings went up significantly after the U.S. was involved in tsunami relief. And this is a side of the U.S. I think that the world has not seen recently, which I think hurts our interests. President Biden's values diplomacy, right? He talks a lot about the value of democracy and human rights, and viewing our relationship with China and our antagonism to China and Russia in this values prism, but it doesn't have a lot of muscle behind it, particularly in Asia. There is a lot of concern in the region about what a second Trump administration would mean, and countries are concerned in general about polarization within the United States, disengagement from the United States, and again, this question of distraction. All right, I will stop it there.
Well, that was fascinating. Thank you. And thorough. It really touched on so much in such a short amount of time. But the first question I have is actually a simple one. The vice president looks so young. He looks like a boy. I mean, how old is he? Is he 18 even?
No, he's in his 30s. He's in his 30s.
Okay, because he looks so young. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. So he's not, so he's under 35 perhaps. And that
Right.
is that the age
Yeah,
cutoff?
exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, good. Well, okay. So, but you also talked about, I mean, there was no opposition to this happening. There was not a, didn't people feel uncomfortable about you're just doing this because it's the former president's son. You want to give him a job. Why not give him another job, right? Even the head of a department would be better than vice president.
Well, so he was, forget, he was mayor or governor of Solo. He was in office already. So he
Okay.
does have political experience. But the sense in this election was that, Jokowi was really popular. The outgoing president had really, really high, popularity ratings, right? Something Americans don't know very much about these days. And the recent tradition really has been that outgoing presidents sort of step away. They don't really put their thumbs on the scale. But Jokowi was really out there during the campaign. He was campaigning really hard. He was he was campaigning with his son. So there really was a sense that this was not a fair campaign, that he was tipping the scales in a pretty concerted way.
But they still got the majority of the votes. I mean, the elections were free and fair as far as
Yeah,
we can, right?
yeah. I think elections are free and fair. The my read of it is that because Jokowi is really popular because he has focused very much on bread and butter kinds of issues, right? It's the economy. And over and over and over again, he prioritized public works, right? Social safety net spending. And I think voters overwhelmingly kind of prefer that, right? Like, what have you done for me lately kind of strategy. And what democracy advocates say is, they kind of wring their hands and say, well, why aren't people more worried about democracy and good governance and corruption and the fact that Prabowo has this horrible human rights issue? And some people have said, well, the voter base is very young.
So
The
they don't.
atrocities
Yeah.
attributed to Prabowo are sort of ancient history to a 20-year-old voter, and a 19-year-old voter. But I think it may be better explained by these bread and butter issues that, they recovered from COVID, the economy is looking pretty good, and Jokowi is so popular that his popularity kind of rubbed off on Prabowo and Gibran. And also is a three-way race. So you don't have to win.
Yeah. So that there was a spoiler in it. But I will say this, that it also seems to me to be a sign of what we have seen to be this emerging rich country that is perhaps more stable and more secure, and people, and it was interesting that the president didn't have to come across as the strong man anymore, could come across as the lovable grandfather. Right? I mean, that's
Right.
a sign where you're feeling comfortable if that's your leader, right?
Yeah. And look, I think there was a lot of use of social media, right?
Yeah.
TikTok and Facebook. Indonesians are very digital, right? They get their news from, their phones more than
Very
long
young.
form
A lot of them are
journalism.
young, right? Yeah.
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 Yeah. And Prabowo had a great kind of social media presence, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Well,
there are a lot of questions in the chat and the
yeah,
Q&A. What's
that's what I'm
your
going to now.
usual
Let
MO?
me, yeah, I'm going to go to it now. And one of the questions, it gets to this issue of China and the relationship that Indonesia has with China. The question is, there are quite a number of ethnic Chinese in Indonesia, and what is their status in the country? Have they been assimilated into the fabric?
Yeah, so how many hours are we here tonight? Um, yeah, so I'll try and give a quick answer, and it really depends what time period you're looking at.
Hmm.
The Chinese suffered disproportionately in this spasm of violence after 1965, after this supposed coup attempt, because the Chinese were accused of being communist, which in Indonesia was a little bit of a strange accusation because the Chinese are also simultaneously accused of being the business tycoons and controlling the economy. So, okay, are you pro-communist or are you, masters of the universe and controlling the business? But despite the fact that those two things cannot really be simultaneously true, the Chinese were horrifically targeted and suffered disproportionately during the killings. Under Suharto, then, for the next 35 years, there was really a forced assimilation program. Chinese had to take Indonesian names. They could not speak Chinese. But it was a little bit of a two-faced assimilation because their identity cards were also coded, right? It wasn't like stamped, right? It didn't say you're Chinese, but it was widely understood that even if they'd changed their names, even if they spoke Indonesian, that they had trouble getting jobs like in the civil service, that getting into university, that there were kind of informal quotas for ethnic Chinese. In the financial crisis in 97, 98, the Chinese again were targeted. Chinese shop owners, Chinese businesses were looted. Their shops were burned to the ground. They were blamed for the economic problems because they were seen as cronies of Suharto. After that, there was some of a reckoning. Like there was actually an accounting and acknowledgement that ethnic Chinese had been singled out, that they had been persecuted, and a whole bunch of laws were passed at the end of the 1990s allowing Chinese to publish materials in Chinese, allowing Chinese language newspapers to start again, adding Lunar New Year as a holiday. There was really a kind of an attempt to bring the ethnic Chinese, kind of more into the fold of Indonesia, but without forcing assimilation. So things are better,
Right.
but it's not perfect.
But there's a history there. Well, and this other question, I'll take this since we're dealing with China. They want to know, is Indonesia wed to China, as so many nations throughout its Belt and Road Initiative are? Doesn't sound like that's the case, but what is it the case?
Well, I would say they are cooperating with China. China is building high-speed rail. Whether those projects are explicitly part of Belt and Road kind of depends on, what China's like narrative and what their Belt and Road maps are looking like at the moment. And the Indonesian government has to tread carefully also, the same way I said that they need to tread carefully because of concerns over Israel with their relationship with the U.S. Similar, their relationship with China, they are cautious. They want the investment, they want the railroads, but Indonesians get very angry when they think that the Chinese are bringing in Chinese labor and not using Indonesians for those jobs. And there have been some riots at Chinese, work sites. So the Indonesian government tries very hard to say, we're only there. It's not thousands. It's not, it's not 30,000 Chinese who are taking your jobs. So there is a balancing act. But yes, there is a lot of Chinese investment.
And there's definitely a strong connection from what I'm hearing. Let me, can you go into more detail? One of our viewers is asking, on the concerns you mentioned regarding the new administration. Does the island's geography potentially make democracy more difficult to maintain?
So Indonesia is so diverse, not just because of all the islands, but because ethnically, religiously, it isn't just an incredibly diverse country. The video mentioned the religious diversity, right? There are Protestants, Catholics, Hindus. Muslims are the largest majority, some Buddhists. But I think just as important as those religious distinctions, there are very clear ethnic distinctions, right? The Achenese, right? Aceh is this province all the way at the tip, kind of where Islam first entered Indonesia. They have a lot of autonomy. They have implemented Islamic law, Sharia law. So the country, local areas have a lot of autonomy, and that autonomy has actually, I think, been very good for the country because it allows local areas to say, hey, we can control a certain amount of our own revenue. We can elect political parties, regional political parties that best represent our interests. But just like in the United States, you're going to have this tension, right, between the national government and the regional governments, the same way we do. So I don't know, is that good for democracy? Is that bad for democracy? I think it depends who and what the issue is.
Well, I would think there, but the inaction of Islamic law would cause some concerns for the Christians, even though it's not in their area. Still, that's a kind of
Right.
creeping danger. What are relations like among the different religions and ethnic groups?
So there have been some really horrible spasms of local violence, some between Christian and Muslim communities, and some of that violence really was brought about by migration incentives, internal migration incentives, that under Suharto incentives were given, right? Java is so densely populated, right? That main island where Jakarta is, that the government gave incentives for people to leave Jakarta for outer islands like Sulawesi and parts of Kalimantan. But anytime you have a new group of people coming in, you're disrupting, right, communal relations. And so you saw this moment after 97, 98, when Suharto is swept out of office. You had an authoritarian leader who had a really firm grip on power and control over the military. That's gone. There's a power vacuum. And you had some pretty nasty episodes of ethnic violence in places like Poso and Sulawesi. Things are pretty calm now, and there has been a lot of efforts to kind of rebuild community relations to try and put a damper on that kind of communal tension. And I think democracy has helped with that. Those episodes of violence also became opportunities for militant Islamic groups who may not have necessarily instigated it, but used it, right, to kind of jump in for their own interests and their own purposes. And Indonesia has done a fairly good job breaking up militant Islamic groups. A lot of arrests, long sentences, but it's not perfect.
Right, right. Interesting. Okay, but efforts are being made to quell that. Let me take a question here that came from Sheila. She asked, "Can you discuss the importance of the Strait of Malacca linking the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean to the United States, and the degree to which Indonesia is at the center of this trade route?"
Yes. Yeah. So absolutely, the Malacca Straits are really critical for world trade. And just like with the South China Seas, further east, the US is very concerned about this. And we're concerned both because of the amount of shipping that goes through. The Malacca Straits have also been a site of piracy. When I tell my students, piracy, they what? And the US has actually helped promote regional cooperation between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia to better monitor what's happening in the Malacca Straits, right? And those waterways that kind of go by Aceh, both to try and stay on top and cut down on piracy. And piracy is usually driven also by local weaknesses, right? When there's instability, criminality is just easier to get away with. And when the economy is poor, piracy, the rewards look pretty enticing if you can't get a regular job. So again, having a strong economy, having a functioning political system helps with some of that. But to this question about US interest and Chinese interest, certainly the US is concerned because of China's activities all around the Straits of Malacca, And so the US's response has really been to try and bolster local capacity with Coast Guard and some kind of naval assistance. Most of the countries don't want the US to butt in, to be honest. They want our help. They want some sophisticated radar and training, but that doesn't mean they want us parking ourselves there.
Yeah,
So
interesting.
it's a balance.
Well, again, it looks like we've had a kind of checkered history in Indonesia anyway, so I can understand that. The other question here is how confident is the financial community that Indonesia is really going to join the Big Four economic club?
Yeah, I found that statement, I'm not an economist. I found
Mm-hmm.
that statement a little bit surprising because Indonesia's economy is looking good, which is great. It's, there's still really high levels of poverty. Um, but it feels to me like there are some very significant underlying issues in the Indonesian economy that just make me skeptical. So, for example, I think it's about 9 million Indonesians working overseas, right, that are migrant workers. That's 7% of the population. And they're not, working as an investment banker at Goldman Sachs in Singapore. No, I mean, Indonesian migrants the men are working in construction, they're working on palm oil plantations, they're working on rubber plantations, or doing construction, in the Gulf states. Women are working as nannies and maids and elder care throughout, Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, the Gulf states, some factory work. Lots of Indonesian men working on commercial fishing fleets
Mm.
in Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore. So, the idea that Indonesia is going to kind of join the ranks of the fully developed countries, it really feels as if they have a lot of domestic things to work out first. Because most of the migrant workers, they're doing that to send money home.
Yes, yeah.
And so until they can create, 9 million more jobs, and then that group of young people coming into the workforce, that's a pretty big nut to crack.
And it's a pretty big country from what we've seen. What was it? More than 200 million, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
so that's a
Yeah,
lot.
close to almost 300 million. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's our size almost, right?
right,
So, yeah,
right.
yeah. Well, all right. So the final thing we have to take up here, I mean, there really is so much we could talk about with Indonesia. It's truly fascinating, and you bring some clarity to some of this. Thank you for that. But we heard that the Indonesians clearly because of their Muslim heritage and all, care about the Palestinians and what's going on there, and I'm sure they're livid over Gaza. But it is surprising that they're not that same level of concern for the Uyghurs. But what about Tibet? Someone is asking. Is there also lack of concern for Tibet?
Wow, Tibet certainly has fallen off the world's radar screen. So I would say that's maybe not unique to Indonesia. Um, so I think there are a couple of really big differences. One, the world's attention is pretty focused on Gaza, and even prior to October and really the escalation, right, the horrific escalation of the conflict, um, journalists have had a lot of access to Gaza and the West Bank. Journalists don't have access to Xinjiang, where the Uyghur community is. So I think one, there's a pretty big difference in terms of access to information, right? Just in
Yeah.
terms of regular reporting. And that goes for us too, right? I mean, um, second, the Chinese diplomats have done an enormous amount to counter the information that does come out about the Uyghurs. And the New York Times did a unit on this maybe about a year ago, where they show the Chinese government with a really well-planned, executed social media strategy countering accusations of, detentions and imprisonment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Um, And if all you are is on social media, you know, if you're not reading the Washington Post and you're not reading Amnesty International's reports, there's a lot of counter narrative
Mm, mm.
about the Uyghurs that China puts out. And I think it really has affected views around the world about what's going on there. So I think that's part of the explanation.
So when does our new president take office? Because we're going to keep our eyes on Indonesia just to see how when is he stepping into
Yeah,
office?
I don't think he steps in until summer. That's a really good question. There's a really long kind of
Yeah.
transition period.
Transition.
I think it's not until June sometime, but I have to check.
Okay. Well, we will be watching with you because you have made us quite interested in keeping tabs on what's going on with Indonesia, and especially as was described, it's an emerging, at least, economic power, and we need to have friends in the region if we're going to deal with China. So with that, Dr. Friedman, I want to thank you so much. You truly have made this all. Yeah, the applause are going up. You have made
Well,
this most
thank you.
most fascinating. And we hope to see you back in our region sometime soon and we can have something with you in person. So let us know when you're coming back
Wonderful.
to our region. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It was a
All right.
pleasure.
Thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Goodbye now.